under 63.1 of the NEC, there's a mechanism that allows the project manager to have more definition around using actual cost and forecast cost for how you're going to price or quote for a compensation amount. So it defines when you're going to take the dividing line between cost incurred and forecasting of future cost into account. Seems to me, though, that that clause doesn't say that you address the time impact of the compensation event in the same way. So you end up almost with, and if that's right, you end up with a disjoint between how you're looking at time and how you're looking at money, which would be a bad thing. Is that how you read the clause, Ewan?
Well, I'm recognising what you're describing there. So the assessment of time or delay is under 63.3, and then under 63.1 it primarily addresses cost. But it does introduce this slight confusion, because this sort of switch state that they refer to between cost, actual cost incurred versus forecasted cost, they say is the date that the project manager should have instructed a quotation to be submitted. Well, that could be very indicative or persuasive about when a compensation event occurred or the date that you should incur or should be used. But my point would be this: if a compensation event has occurred and it's not notified for 6 weeks, and then there's an instruction to submit a quotation, there then becomes a significant period of time between the two, and there is a disconnect.
Mm-hmm. I think you can take that to you can take it a little bit further, can't you? If you even under the time bar, you get to 7 weeks and 6 days before the contractor's compelled to notify, and then the project manager might take another week, so that takes you to 8 weeks and 6 days before you've got the quotation request. And of course, from a contractor's point of view, he might well turn around and say, well, I'm not really sure about this compensation. I'm not sure how I'm going to price it. I don't want to price it too high, because the project manager will take over the assessment, and then it will be wrong, and I'll be in all sorts of trouble and have to have a battle with him. But if I price it too low, I'm going to be shut out. So rather than having all of that, why don't I just de-risk it by just doing it and then claiming effectively the cost? So I just de-risk it. Is that a legitimate strategy, Ian?
Well, it's potentially it's an allowable strategy under the contract, albeit the contract does drive and push for proactively trying to assess this thing on a prospective basis. For me, I'm not sure there's a massive issue in one respect here, in that the way I look at the contract, when you come to impact a compensation event in terms of time, you update the programme before you impact a compensation event. It comes back to this idea that you have to show the impact of the compensation event on the remaining activities. Therefore, for me, you have to update the programme to the point in time. So the question is, what is that point in time? And that is the issue. So for me, a compensation event involving money, a compensation event involving time, will both be a combination of what's happened to the point in time that we're making, if you like, the assessment, and then forecasting forward. In terms of money, we have a definitive cut-off point in relation to notification in terms of instructions, whereas in terms of time we don't have that. And so I think that does leave a bit of a question mark of whether it should be the same point, which seems logical, but it's not articulated in the contract.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, because as soon as you get a disjoint, I think you're in danger territory of over or under pricing, or the pricing just making no sense because it doesn't actually attach to the time. And I take your point on the contract programming element. So looking at the delay is going to be all based around an updated program, and the question is updated to when. And I guess, coming back to the point that Ewan was making about you can delay the point at which a quotation should be given by quite a long way, and that's what defines the cost element. But when you come to look at the time element of it, you'd have to be assessing the time element in relation to the accepted program that was in play before the compensation event arose. Otherwise, the effect of the compensation event is already in the program that you're then trying to put the compensation event into and see a movement. And there obviously won't be a movement because the impact's already there. So that can't be the right program. So you end up in this situation where the time and cost are running quite separately from each other. And from my point of view, I think it's confusing. And the sort of step forward for defining that cut-off point has actually created a problem that didn't really exist before. Ewan, do you see that?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that's what I was putting forward. Yes, there is a disconnect between the time of impact of a compensation event and the date that a quotation should be submitted that's used for cost. And you could have 2 months' worth of people cost or site overhead type costs, etc. And yet, are they forecast or are they actual costs because of this different slant between 63.1 and 63.3?
I'd agree with everything that's been said. I think apart from Rob, you saying retrospective step or whatever you said compared with the second edition. The reason why it was put in there was because what project managers were doing was saying, give me a forecast quotation, and let's say the contractor would say, well, I think it's going to be £1,000 plus my fee percentage. Oh, sucking of teeth, that looks a bit high, go ahead and do it. And the contractor would do it, they'd take records, and it would come at 900 quid, and the project manager would go, no, it was 900 quid plus your fee. And you go, well, okay, the contractor hasn't lost, they've got their fee percentage. But what really irked the contractors was, well, I think it's going to be £1,000, ooh, bit high, assess it on records, it comes in at 1,100, and suddenly the project manager thinks that 1,000 is a realistic figure. And in that way, it's that the contractor definitely loses out. So as heads I don't win, tails I lose, a bit one-sided. So that's why it was introduced, and that was quite a common situation. Whereas I don't think that the situation we've described is as common a problem as that was. The other benefit of this is that pushing towards forecasts is it sort of pushes the project manager to define what they want the contractor to price up, which is the biggest complaint I get from contractors. We're just told to sort of solve a problem. Well, here's how I do it. Well, that's not what I meant. So pushing towards forecasts is generally a good thing.
So summarising that conversation then, I think the primary aim of setting this cut-off date between using cost incurred and forecasting of cost is probably a good thing. The fact that it doesn't tie up all the different elements of a compensation event is probably a weakness and is something that people at least need to bear in mind when you look at it, because it is going to cause a potential stumbling block. And if you haven't thought about how you're going to deal with that disconnect, you could run into trouble quite quickly, at least in the sense of not being able to engage early and agree compensation events and having to fall back on the less collaborative assessment requirements where the project manager will then simply impose his view of what should be happening rather than having a jointly prepared quotation which is agreed and then implemented. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.